No, oh yes, it's in the cemetery.
Yeah.
No, I've got the
Mr. Mayor, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my enormous privilege to welcome you to the Playhouse, the home of the Halifax Thespians since 1945. Yes, 1945. It's a long, long time, but still not as old as our society, which was formed in 1927. But the mathematicians amongst you will have realised that this means we will be celebrating our 90th anniversary next year. Sadly, none of our founder members will be sharing this celebration. This afternoon we are very proud to be celebrating something else, which is very significant to our society. The association of Halifax Thespians with Dr. Phyllis Plaque, one of our founder members, a past chairman and past president of this society. I don't intend to try to give you a potted history of her life, as we have Dr. David Russell with us, who is eminently qualified to cover that area. However, I do have one anecdote concerning Phyllis, which is unlikely to feature in any of the academic archives. When I was a youth, I was told that my sister, who was several years my senior, had purchased a writing desk from an antique shop in Brickhouse, which this writing desk had supposedly belonged to Phyllis Plaque. This filled me with pride because it was at this very desk that I studied for my O-levels and then my A-levels. And somehow I felt the influence of Phyllis oozing from every grain of that children. I sensed the aura of creativity which this desk had supported. Phyllis wrote her masterpiece, or should that be mistress piece, Inheritance, on this very piece of furniture. Inheritance is a story told against the backdrop of the West Riding during the Industrial Revolution and the activities of the Luddites, who were very active all across this part of Yorkshire. These themes have always been passions of mine, and perhaps, just possibly, my inspiration came from this antique table. In order to verify the facts and dates of this reminiscence, last night I rang my sister. Sadly, it seems that I have been labouring under a misapprehension. It seems that our desk was not that of Phyllis Plaque at all. Phyllis's desk was for sale that day, but was rejected by my sister because it was riddled with woodwork. Which probably explains why Phyllis wanted to get rid of it. Anyway, without further ado, I think it's time that we move to the primary reason for being here, the unveiling of the commemorative plaque. May I now introduce the Mayor of Coaldale, Mr. Harold Bagbra.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, what an honour and privilege it is for me to be here today, and on this weekend as well, of Heritage Weekend, where we praise all the wonderful buildings and also the people that made the wonderful buildings. A building isn't a building without people inside it, and people like Phyllis, of course. So it's a great honour to be here to recognise a lady that was quite remarkable in her works, considering especially the period that she was born and lived to, of course. So quite a number of years and quite a number of writings. Her name will live on, I'm sure. And with this plaque, it's absolutely amazing to have a blue plaque and to be able to be here to actually unveil and to actually make history as well. So today we are making history by unveiling a plaque in recognition of what a wonderful lady and many talents. So without further ado, I think I will unveil this wonderful plaque, if that's okay with you myself. Yes, indeed. I've been told all I have to do is tug it. So, right, so after 3, 1, 2, 3. Yes, yeah.
First of all, many thanks indeed for the invitation to give the lecture, and many thanks for you to coming out this afternoon on this wonderful September Sunday afternoon. Phyllis Bentley is clearly one of the most significant cultural figures that Halifax ever produced, and it's absolutely fitting that she should be a candidate for a blue plaque. And it is absolutely fitting that it's in this building that is erected. Phyllis had a great love of the Halifax thespians most of the time, as we'll see. Might come as a shock to some of you to know that there are quite big egos involved in amateur dramatics. There were, you know, fallouts. But she was so much loved the thespians, they much loved her, and she much loved this building. Put a great deal of time, as we'll see, physical effort into making turning the Hanover Methodist Chapel into the playhouse. She was also a great lover of all things Italian. So what a wonderful set to be to present from. When I first discovered Phyllis, I actually had never heard of her. But I was preparing for what eventually became a book on the history of the north of England, and I was just buying things that looked interesting. And I came across a signed copy of her autobiography, O Dreams, O Destinations, in a bookshop, and got really, really interested in it. I mean, if you want to read a really good autobiography of what it was like to be a middle-class woman of academic ambition in the 20th century, it is a wonderful read. It's extraordinarily honest for an autobiography. It pulls very few punches, although it does pull a few, as we'll see. But as I got more interested, I began to read her novels. And then what finally clinched my interest was when we moved into Halifax in 2001 and discovered we lived just down the road from Heath Villas, where she spent 50 years of her life, and also very near to Inroy in Broomfield Avenue, where she died. So for a while in our household we had two regular walks, one local walk and one walk up to Whalley, where she also lived with her sister-in-law in the Grange for a number of years in 1963. So those two walks became known in our house as a long and a short Phyllis. And it's still known that sometimes referred to this day. When I got interested in her, she was a very obscure figure indeed. She died in June 1977. At a time when her reputation was quite high, but then she more or less disappeared from public view. It's hard to know why. There was a lot of interest in women writers. A lot of Victorian Edwardian women writers were rediscovered at that time. Whether publishers didn't think her work was good enough, whether her politics were wrong. She was a feminist, but of a very distinctive individualist kind, and maybe those politics didn't quite play with sort of feminist publishing politics of the 1980s, but she really had kind of disappeared. That's changed a great deal in the last few years, and obviously today's event is a very important part of that change. Locally, a number of people drew attention to Phyllis Bentley's work. Somebody who's here today, Margaret Barnes, was very important in uncovering, doing work on Phyllis's private papers and lecturing to local societies and increasing her profile. And she also tracked down 3 plays, which I don't think anybody actually knew Phyllis had written. It was really early, almost teenage, early 20s bits of writing, which were then performed here by the Thespians downstairs in 2012 as part of the Halifax Festival. And then a number of other initiatives. Royd Press began to publish her children's novels, of which we'll talk a little bit about later on. And then finally in 2012, New Bloomsbury publishers began to reprint her novels, which has got an important breakthrough. I phoned quite an eminent feminist publishing house in about 2008, 2009 to suggest they might take an interest in publishing some of Phyllis's stuff, and was told by a wonderfully posh lady who I don't think would have impressed Phyllis very much. That they were aware of her, but didn't think she produced anything of value. So I won't mention the publisher, just in case they're here. But News Bloomsbury, began publishing her work. And the next slide, Jed, please. The most remarkably of all is the publication last year in America of Chain of Witnesses, which is a collection of her short stories about Miss Phipps. These were little money spinners that she began in 1938, published in the States, mainly in Ellery Queen's Mystery magazine, about a female writer detective who solves crimes based on literary clues that the criminal leaves behind. It's published by the magnificently named company Crippen and Landau. To my certain knowledge, the only publishing house consciously named after mass murderers. Our own Crippen, I'm not sure Crippen was a mass murderer, he was certainly a murderer, and a French serial killer called Henri Landru. So that's quite a coup, isn't it, in publishing terms. But it's very nice indeed that 38 years after her death, someone should think that these, what she saw as rather light and throwaway pieces, were worthy of publication. So she is now kind of out there again, which is excellent, and I don't think will disappear again. What I'm going to do today is in no way a literary talk. It's not about her literary work and style, although obviously it's impossible to talk to Phyllis Plaque without talking about her writing. But really I'm going to try to offer a sketch of her life, talk about her contributions to the cultural life of Halifax, Yorkshire and the wider north, mainly with reference to the Thespians. But then also to end by talking about some of the complications of that relationship. Phyllis actually had a far more troubled relationship with Halifax and Yorkshire and the north of England than she certainly let on in public, and particularly in the late 1930s was miserable almost to the point of suicide about her life in Halifax. And although I don't want to end on that gloomy note today, I would like to look at that in a little bit of detail. So, first of all, a bit on her life. She was born in Halifax on the 19th of November 1894. And apart from a short spell as a child in Huddersfield when the family moved, for business reasons, and a short spell in Kent, and then some work in London during the First and Second World Wars, she spent the whole of her life in Halifax. For the next slide, Jed. So I'll come back to... can you go on to the next? Yeah, one after that, sorry. That's brilliant. We'll go back to Dunkirk Mills in a moment. I've got my running order wrong. It's very unusual for a major cultural figure from the provinces to spend their life in the provinces. People, by definition, almost inevitably end up going to London, because that's where, as we know, this is a Londoner who's become an adopted northerner, that's where we're told the true centre of the world is, and that's where we have to be. She bucked that trend, but just to give an example of other significant Halifax cultural figures, all three of whom deserve their own plaque. Three people who again, of real significance nationally, who were born in Halifax and moved away. That isn't a picture of Matthew Smith on the left. In case you're worried, it's one of his famous nude paintings from the 1920s. But Smith, the son of a Halifax, leading Halifax figure, wire workers, left Halifax only after a great struggle with his father to study art at the Slade in 1905, and then went to live in France for much of his life. In the middle, George Dyson, one of the forgotten sons of Halifax, the son of an engineering works blacksmith from Ovenden, who grew up in Lee Mount, went on to become the Master of the Queen's Music, the principal of the Royal Academy, the Royal College of Music, and a fairly major figure in British classical music in the 20th century. And then finally on the right, these are all people who are roughly contemporaneous with Phyllis. But on the right, Walter Widdop, who will be known to some of you from Norland, Just in case you think that people in Norland dress like that on a regular basis, don't worry, we'd have dressed in costume for Siegfried for a performance with the British National Opera Company. But again, Dyson was born here and educated here, but went to London to pursue his career. Widdop, who was a dye house worker, father was a quarryman in Norland, he was a dye house worker, lived in Skirkut, and then eventually ended up moving to London to pursue his career, and ended up, as so many artistic figures do, living in Hampstead. Phyllis's career is a very, very different one indeed, and I've sort of laboured that point a little bit because I think it will become very important when I return to her sort of complex relationship with her hometown. If we go back to the previous slide, sorry about this. She was born in 1894. She's the youngest of 4 children and the only daughter, which is a very significant point, of Joseph, her much loved father, Joseph, and her much less loved mother, Eleanor. At the time of her birth, her father, Joseph, was a junior partner in a textile business at Dunkirk Mills. Dunkirk Mills still with us. And later he was to take that over and run it as his own, as a dyeing and finishing works. She's a very clever woman indeed. She went to, very bright academically, went to Halifax High School for girls, and then to Cheltenham Ladies College, which was to have a huge influence on her life. At this time, she was at Cheltenham College just before the First World War. It was actually possible to do a degree at a girls' public school, and she did actually get a first-class pass degree, sort of general degree, from Cheltenham in 1914. She then came back to Halifax, had a brief and disastrous spell trying to teach boys at Heath. Went back to London. There's some chuckles there of people who tried to do similar things, I think. She then went back to London to work as a clerk, and then came back to Halifax, the classic surplus woman, a young, unmarried woman trying to make her way in the world with huge expectations from the family about what she should and shouldn't do. The one thing she was certain of was that she wanted to be a writer. She loved literature, absorbed huge amounts of it. Great fan of Hardy, great fan of the Brontes, great fan of Arnold Bennett, and later developed a very wide-ranging taste to embrace people at very different writing schools like Virginia Woolf. But she loved literature, and she wanted to contribute and be a writer. She worked very hard at it. She published a volume of stories called The World's Bane in 1918, which her brother helped fund, brother Norman. 3 brothers, the older brother Philip, who emigrated to Australia, and then Norman and Frank, who lived in Halifax and works in the family business. His brother Frank was also heavily involved in the thespians, and very much, I think, probably Phyllis is favourite, the one who's closest to her in age. She finally published her first novel in 1922 called Environment, which is quite heavily autobiographical. She also did a lot of part-time work cataloguing collections in libraries and a lot of voluntary work. But she just battled away, determined to be a writer. It was a very gradual process. Her breakthrough, as we've already heard from Leighton when we were looking at when unveiling the plaque earlier on, her breakthrough novel was Inheritance, published when she was 38 in 1932. So skip to on, Jake. That's the cover of the American version of Inheritance. You can't find a cover of the British edition. As we've already been told with John, it's a family saga. It was originally called The Oldroyds, the dominant family, but it's really a panoramic take on Yorkshire industrial society from 1812 to the very early 1930s. It's a history of the West Riding textile district in fiction. It was an enormous success. It is one of the key books of the interwar period. It was in the Bookman, the literary magazine. Winifred Holtby wrote a review of the year's books, in which she said, Inheritance was one of the 3 books of the year. Well, the other 2 were The Fountain by Charles Morgan and Huxley's Brave New World. So you can see the kind of company she's keeping. Now, Holby was a close friend of hers, but she was also a very honest woman. There was no way she was going to give false praise to Phyllis just because she was a friend of hers. The book, the timing of the book was phenomenal because it came out at the absolute height of the Depression of the early 1930s, when unemployment rates were at their absolute highest over that winter of 1932-33, and the north of England was in people's minds. And I think it really did. It was a timely novel which came out at a moment when people would pay attention to it. But I think she also cleared the way for other northern writers. There's a lot of writing in the 1930s, books like Love on the Dolls, which is the most famous. A lot of writing in the 1930s about the north of England. And I think Phyllis played a crucial role in clearing the way for other northern writers. The book was serialised in the Daily Dispatch, which was a sort of quasi-national newspaper printed in Manchester. And by 1950, it had gone through 28 editions and been published in 8 different languages, which gives you some kind of idea of its standing. Next one, please, Jed. You won't. I'm not expecting you to read that. Actually, I am. There'll be a test at the end. But it's just to give you an idea of how hard she worked as a writer. In the club, she left all, well, not all, some things she chose not to leave. But she left her diaries, many of her personal papers, and all her manuscripts to be used in Halifax Library, to be opened on 25 years after her death, and they became available, which was in 2002. But you can see that she worked very hard at her scripts. That's the sort of penultimate draft of Inheritance, with lots of crossings out and circlings and changes. She worked and worked at stuff in a very intense way. It was her biggest success by a long way. Excuse me to keep sniffing. She was never able to repeat it, but she became a significant and popular middle-brow novelist for the next 20 or 30 years, and held a significant audience. It took a big audience, not just in the north of England, but nationally, and also in the States, where she had a small but significant following. She genuinely believed by the 1950s that her days were numbered, not literally, but that as a novelist she was finished. In her autobiography she says how she'd been swept away by this tide of new writing, this new wave of writing, by young male writers, that John Brain, Stan Barstow, Sillitoe, David Lodge, trying to think who wrote This Sporting Life, and I can't think. David Storey, thank you very much. It's been a long weekend. The emotion of watching Halifax Place David But she genuinely believed that that was it, and she was kind of sad that it was because that they were all males, and though she liked them, as we'll see in a minute, she was very good to them, very helpful to them. She felt that her days were over. Then along came a director at Granada Television in 1966, and Granada, as many of you will know, had this remit of serving the north of England, a remit which it took immensely seriously. And one of its producers was just leafing through novels that people had given him, and he hit upon Inheritance, and the two of her many novels that particularly, in a sense, moved the story of Inheritance forward. The Rise of Henry Morcar, which had come out in 1946, is my own personal favourite Bentley novel, and also A Man of His Time, which updated Rise of Henry Morcar, and he cobbled them together into a trilogy and made an immensely successful Granada TV series, which appeared in 1967 and then was repeated in 1969. Jed, if we could have the next. Sorry, that's just I've forgotten that. This happens when you're not got the slides in front of you. Just to make the point of her kind of status as a novelist in this period. This is the Wills for Quality, the Wills Cigarette famous British novelist series. And there we have Phyllis Bentley. And she was in there with people like Monica Dickens and Neville Shute and others, and the sort of level at which she was operating. In fact, I think we are on the next one. now. If you've got very good eyes, sorry, these are the best I could make these slides, you might just recognise a youthful-ish James Bolam on the right-hand side of that picture, post the Lightly Lads. But on the next one, you will definitely, I hope, recognise John Thor, which is his breakthrough part in the TV adaptation of Inheritance. And she had this glorious sort of late bottom to her career as a result. Many of her books were republished. 3 of them were published in pan paperback, which is a huge accolade for an author. And David Hanson in his piece on Phyllis in Friday's Courier, a very nice picture of the pan edition of Inheritance, if you want to look that up. She was awarded the OBE for her services to writing in 1970, which went along with an honorary doctorate that she got from Leeds University in 1949 and a fellowship of the Royal Society of Literature, which she got in 1958. So a wonderful kind of late blooming, but as I say, rather sadly, with her death, that they had this long silence. Next one, Jeff, please. And yes, I don't know why, I just like that picture of Phyllis on top of South Arran Bank. It's a very kind of new wave picture, isn't it? It's a press publicity still, at the time when the smoky, grimy north was very, very fashionable, years just after Coronation Street, and I like to see that as a slightly punky Phyllis, and the new wave Phyllis being rediscovered. Next, please. I'm not trying to sell Phyllis Bentley to you as a great writer, because she clearly wasn't, and many of you will have read her novels, but she's not some great undiscovered genius, and she accepted that herself. I think this analysis from an American professor writing in 1967 sums that up very well. She was a thoroughly competent novelist moving in the mainstream of the English novel. And that's exactly what she was good at doing, creating very believable characters, very strong narratives, very good at plotting, dialogue that got better and better as she got more and more experienced. And it's that kind of good middle brow, intelligent books approachable by intelligent readers, but she wasn't trying to break the mould. She wasn't a Virginia Woolf. She wasn't trying to do new things with literature. She was trying to communicate with people through fairly mainstream forms of writing. Next one, Jeff, please. Not everybody liked her writing. I think that Inheritance was generally very well received, but 3 slightly different reviews here. I'll read these just for people who can't see it, over on the right-hand side. Ralph Strauss reviewing it in the Sunday Times, a fine and memorable novel, a brilliant piece of work that will undoubtedly be one of the novels of the year. The Daily Telegraph, a sedative work. It's a brilliant phrase, that. I used it on student essays a few times. If only they'd known what it meant, it would have been quite a good put down. And then one from Everyman, which I particularly like. Her work has the air of homework, conscientiously executed, which is a bit of a put down, but I know a little bit what they're driving at there. What she was trying to do for most of her life was present the north of England to the national culture. Next one, please, Jeff. This is a lengthy actually, and I'll read it through, from the Yorkshire Post, which she wrote a lot of journalism for the Yorkshire Post in the 1920s while she was building towards building a literary career. But she really did have a strong sense of the North as being secondary within the national culture. That outside, particularly in London, it was seen as this uncivilized place. And much of her writing and novels were trying to make it clear that this was just wrong. Those Yorkshire women who, like myself, visit but do not live in London know well the dubious look which comes over the faces of London acquaintances when they hear the name of our native town. It is a look half compassion, half alarm. The ignorance of Londoners about the provinces is really astonishing, and I can vouch for that as someone who grew up. In vain we tell them that our bright young people are as bright as theirs. In vain we claim that our fellow countrymen, some of the finest exponents of modern art, literature, music, history and science, They persist in regarding us as uncouth savages living in a region beyond the reach of cultural rays. Some would argue some Southerners still see the North like that, but my stepmother resolutely refused to come up here for the entire 84 years of her life, even to see me. What a shame. Thank you for that. She adopted a particular part of the north of England, and it was this immediate area. She was quite a sports fan in her later years. She played sport quite well earlier in her life, but she took to watching rugby and football. She used to record the results of the matches that she'd watched in her diaries, which I always found kind of amusing. But one day in 1965, she was watching a rugby league match when the legendary Eddie Waring, God's gift to television impersonators, was commentating, and he said, I won't risk my Eddie Waring impersonating with my voice that it is, but he said, there's a fair wind coming off this Bentley country tonight. The wind howled over Thrum Hall, and she recorded this in her diary with a kind of little chuckle, and how nice it was that someone had actually coined this term, and perhaps Marketing Halifax might one day want to coin Phyllis Bentley country as a tourist aid. But she created this world when she was writing about real places, she would either set them in Hudley, which is Halifax, or Anartsfield, which is Huddersfield, and also she wrote a lot to Inheritance about the Colne Valley, the Ire Valley, which that became. When she wanted to write about a kind of generalised north, an industrial town, she used a place called Ashworth. What she saw her role as doing was presenting the complexities of northern society to the rest of the world. And she was very good at this sort of panoramic, cross-class view of the world. She claimed that she was a socialist. Her parents were Anglican Tories, and she certainly fell out with them. She was an atheist. She had a very unhappy, brief experience in Kent at a Catholic convent, which she loathed. She lost her religious faith completely. I don't think she ever was a socialist. I think she was a very distinctive kind of progressive liberal. She actually voted Conservative in the 1945 general election because she thought the Labour Party were too dictatorial. But of all the times when people who weren't natural socialists would have voted Labour was 1945. It's odd that she didn't. But what she really did have an ability to see many different sides of the coin. And we've already heard of her writing about Luddites, which was very unusual. The Inheritance begins with this long analysis of Luddism, very sympathetic, trying to explain why the Luddites took the actions they did. It's a very unusual position for an author to be that sympathetic in the 1930s. She wrote superbly about the unemployed workers' movement in her follow-up novel to Inheritance, A Modern Tragedy, which is an excellent book, some very moving writing about the unemployed workers' movement. But her real heroes, as John's alluded, I think, at the beginning here, our real heroes are small to medium-sized family businessmen. It's people like her father, who she celebrated them. Henry Morcar, I think, is her greatest creation of that kind. Someone who came from a skilled working class background became a mill owner. She celebrated them for the hard work that they put in to make their businesses work, but also for their commitment to their communities and their sense of obligation to communities. That many of her fictional characters almost kill themselves for the effort they make to keep their businesses going in order to fulfill their obligations to their workers. And that's how she felt her father, who died in 1926 after the general strike. She felt that the strains of trying to keep that family business going at a very difficult time had been partly responsible for his death. So she's trying then to build this kind of broad landscape that's sympathetic to everybody, but with the local middle classes are the particular heroes. I'm just realising I'm going slightly more slowly than I intended to, so I rattle on a little bit. I've talked a little bit about her as a novelist, but if you if you just talked about Phyllis Plaque as a writer and in terms of her novels, you would get a very poor sense of how much she did. She was an extremely prolific writer. She was just an extraordinarily hard-working woman. I get exhausted reading her diaries. I feel I'd done quite well to get out of bed, have breakfast, and get into the archive by 9:30. Phyllis would have written 3 lectures by then and probably offended somebody. She was responsible for a lot of literary scholarship. She wrote very well about the Brontes. I don't think her Bronte scholarship stood the test of time, but it was highly regarded in its day, and it's significant. Her last ever publication, which was published jointly with John Ogden of Percival Whitley College in 1977, was Howarth of the Brontes. She wrote a book, called a pamphlet really, called The English Regional Novel, which was certainly, until it came out in 1941, and that's the best single thing that anyone wrote on regional novels in this country until the 1990s. I certainly remember reading it as an undergraduate and thinking that I didn't remember I'd read it, but I didn't remember the name of the author. I read it as an undergraduate in the 70s. I was very struck by it. She also wrote a huge amount of book reviews all her life, right almost up to her death. She was writing book reviews for the Yorkshire Post. She wrote history books. She wrote children's stories, which many of you will know. And really, in the late 60s and early 70s, that's almost what she became a children's writer. The Disney Corporation actually bought the rights to a couple of her novels, though never filmed them. She wrote Miss Phipps detective stories. She wrote a huge amount of journalism. Up to 1932, when Inheritance made her name, she earned half of her money from writing, from journalism. She was an outstandingly good lecturer, which is odd for someone who was a very poor school teacher. She was, I think, tried to be too friendly to children and probably a bit too progressive. Didn't realise they'd need a good slapping down. But she toured very successfully the United States of America in the 1930s on several occasions, and talked confidently and well to audiences of up to a couple of thousand people. And some of you who know or remember as a very, very good speaker. And she was also a very good broadcaster. She broadcast from about 1930 frequently on the BBC Northern region, and again continued to broadcast and advise the BBC on various matters northern well into the 1960s. She was a member of a kind of brains trust called the 51 Club, which broadcast in the northern region. One car journey I'd love to have eavesdropped on, in 1959, she appeared on the 51 Club on a programme on working class writing, and her fellow panellist was E.P. Thompson, fellow possessor of a blue plaque, fellow Halifax in the socialist historian. And I was reading a diary hoping I'd find what they found to talk about on the journey back from Manchester to Halifax. It simply says, it was very cold in Edward's little car because his heater had broken. So I was disappointed. So hugely busy as a writer. That sketch of her life was supposed to take rather less time than it did, but I do tend to get carried away when I'm talking about Phyllis, so I apologise for that. Moving on to look at her contribution to local culture and the culture of the West Riding in general. The novel that tells us the most about Phyllis Plaque is Quorum, a book which she published in 1950. It's a novel celebrating committee work. There aren't many of those. She defined in her diary committee work as free cooperation freely given for unselfish ends. And she regarded committee work as of staggering importance. It was a great passion of hers. And that novel is about the 8 people who made up the Ashworth Textile Pageant Committee, people drawn from completely different walks of life, from a mill owner to a typist. And it interweaves their personal stories with the way they come together to make a success of organising a historical pageant. And as I say, I think that novel was the clue to Phyllis Plaque, because she regarded the voluntary society with its committees, its democracy, and yes, its sometimes very intense arguments, as being one of the great features of northern life. Something to be very, very proud of. She wrote a book on committees in the Collins Nutshell series. which I wanted to photograph for this lecture, because on the front is the Halifax Thespian Committee, hard at work in 1962, but unfortunately wasn't allowed to do it for copyright reasons. It was very harsh on people who didn't come up to her standards of committee work. I won't name the individual in case any of his family are here, but one chairman of a local organisation was described in her diary as a boring Welsh windbag. Not particularly politically correct, but Phil was chairing a meeting very, very well. She was involved with a huge range of local voluntary societies and organisations. I've really only got time to talk about the Thespians, which was, as I say, of enormous importance to her. She regarded amateur dramatics as of massive importance. She described the amateur dramatic movement as an instrument of civilization in the North, and I think she regarded it as an instrument of civilization generally. She wasn't an actress. She did do some writing. We've heard already, I mentioned about the plays, the short plays that she wrote. She wrote a one-act play called Sounding Brass, which is a radio play. Sounding Brass, I should say, really, shouldn't I? But we'll come to southern diseases of the vowels later on. I think the Thespians also performed that. And she also wrote a very important work for the Thespians, helped construct a very important work for the Thespians in 1953 as part of the coronation celebration called Cavalcade, which basically produced, she sort of knitted together extracts from about 7 different plays, beginning with a speech by Queen Victoria and coming through to a J.B. Priest and Jakarta Hawks play of 1952 called The Dragon's, I think it's called The Dragon's Mouth. No, someone can, the person who corrected me in rhyme with David's story doesn't know that one. It's a very obscure play. What we've got there is the, I have to remember this actor's name on the left-hand slide. That's the then chairman of the Thespians, Philip Stark Jones, the name would be known to some of you. And the actress playing Queen Elizabeth II is Margaret Bartholomew. And then in the other picture on the right-hand side, we have a slide of the Thespians on this stage doing an extract from the School for Scandal. The female actress is Hazel Marsh, who, again, I don't know if she's known to any of you, but the two males, and I'm not sure who's who, are Arthur Pickles, whether that's any relative of the Pickles dynasty. Father of James, thanks very much, John. I always feel I should know these things, but when John's here I don't need to. He's forgotten more about Halifax than I know. And the other one is Robin Burness. So she, as I say, her real responsibility though with the Thespians was on committees. She was the chairman for a period during the war, the president of Halifax Thespians, almost not continuously, but for a large chunk of the time between 1945 and 1965. And sat on innumerable committees over her time. And she gave so much to the Thespians. I mean, that really, I think, is what does strike me, that she had this tremendous sense of public service and commitment. In 1949, for example, she, as I've already mentioned, she was awarded an honorary doctorate of literature by Leeds University, where she was wheeled up on stage and decked out in her finery, referred to as the Thomas Hardy of the West Riding, which mattered greatly to her. So what would you do when you've been made a doctorate at Leeds University? Would you go out for a meal, perhaps with some friends, a glass of champagne, and sit home and feel smug? No, she came to a Thespians committee meeting where they were discussing a number of riveting topics. The heating for this theatre. Actually, probably in 1949, the heating in this theatre was probably pretty important. How to respond to a request about casting from the Goole Amateur Dramatic Society. And most important of all, the re-election of the dance subcommittee. Now, you know, I don't mean that quite, I'm not being quite as jokey as I'm making that, because that's the essence of society, isn't it? That's what you have to do. But surely she could have given herself a night off. The same year, can we have the next slide, Jeff, please? That's taken from a little pamphlet photo, some of you will have seen, but taken from a pamphlet history of the Thespians, which Phyllis wrote. And that is this place taking shape. In 1949, she was asked to go and do a presentation to go to a literary conference in Venice, which she very much loved. And she turned it down on the basis that she was president of Halifax Thespians. And she had to be here with her paintbrush and a distemper brush and various other brushes, doing her bit to rebuild the theatre, to turn the chapel, Hanover Methodist Chapel, into a theatre. They needed to save money. There was a terrible shortage of labour in 1949, so she happily turned down the chance to go to Venice to help the Thespians. Ever practical, she remembered the Thespians in her will, left them £100, but more importantly said they could take any of her clothing or furniture for props that appealed to them. So an enormous contribution, and as we'll see very briefly in a moment, sometimes at personal cost there were antagonisms, but a lifelong commitment to something that she genuinely believed in. Just very, very briefly, on a couple of other local organisations, she was also, I should have said she was a founder member of the Thespians in 1927. She was also a founder member of Halifax Authors Circle, which was founded in 1926 to try and encourage people like her, young writers, which had a very interesting history, and a number of really quite important writers were attached to it. Probably the best known is Maurice Proctor, who might be known to some of you, a policeman who lived in Woolerfield, whose novel Hell is a City was one of the crime novels of 1954, and it was made as a very successful film in 1960. His papers, he's sufficiently highly regarded in America as a crime writer. His papers are in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology archive, which is quite remarkable. But a vast number of people were involved with the Authors Circle. And again, what's so striking is her commitment. She could have, I think in later life, she sometimes did play the grande dame a little. But she could have said, look, I've made it now, I'm a bit busy. But in 1931 to 39, when she's absolutely at the height of her career, she attended 64 of their 94 meetings. And the one she didn't attend was because she was in America, maybe. In 1959 to 69, she missed just 12 meetings of the Authors Circle. And as with the Thespians, they loved her for it, because they realised this was someone who though very successful, had the interests of other lesser mortals at heart. So in 1970, she chose to have her 70th birthday party with the Authors Circle at the White Swan. And they recorded in the minutes. We considered it the greatest honour she could possibly pay to the Circle. Sorry, my voice really is beginning to go. That for all her worldwide collection of friends, she should agree to spend that momentous day in her life with us. I won't talk about the rest, but I could go on for about another 10 minutes about organisations that she worked with locally. Her friendship to other authors, sometimes generous financial friendship, financial help. She gave £50 to the author Leo Walmsley, who was a friend of hers and absolutely useless with money. And she said to his £50, a lot of money in 1953, don't worry if I don't see it again, because she knew she wouldn't. And was very generous in her support for other writers. It came as quite a surprise to me to find how close a friend she was for a period with John Brain. They're not natural bedfellows. What she thought of the later John Brain, who became really quite an unpleasant individual with a serious vodka and Vimto's habit and some really unpleasant political beliefs. But in Halifax Library hold this collection of books, a personal collection, and there's a copy of Room at the Top. Excuse me, his breakthrough novel, which in the flight list says to Phyllis Plaque, one of my earliest and best teachers, which I think says a lot. It did take a lot out of her. Some of her friends, particularly Storm Jameson, another Yorkshire novelist who's a very close friend of hers, who I'm sure many of you know, kept saying to the 50s, look, you've got to give this up. The Thespians, the Authors Circle, Uncle Tom Cobley and all, to use the phrase that she used, they're just draining you. You've got your own life, you've got your own career. But there were moments when she did sort of take her bat home, as it were. She did break with the Thespians briefly in 1937. They were producing Eugene O'Neill's play Our Wilderness, and her diaries are full of comments like this. A particularly vile meeting. Came home wretched. Wept in the night. H.T. Lee so bitter in his criticism that I almost wept. A couple of years later, she and H.T. Lee are great mates again. But she did feel that she just had to take a back seat. But she just genuinely had this commitment to the locality and to local organisations, and she thought that was her great role. I think this comes from her time at Cheltenham Ladies' College. But the Cheltenham Ladies' College had this great emphasis on doing good and doing good work. Every year you had to write back to the college and say what you had done for the wider good of the world. And I think looking after the cultural institutions of Halifax and Yorkshire was one of her great contributions, was her doing good. But, having said all this, particularly in the late 1930s, but not exclusively in the late 1930s, there were times when she really grew to dislike Halifax intensely. Go to the next slide, just to see. Yeah, we are where I thought I was, which is quite unusual for me. The official story in her autobiography is that when she was a girl, she was a snob. She thought Halifax was unsophisticated, Philistine, beneath her. Came back from Cheltenham full of all these ideas and basically had very little time for these people with their vulgar ways. And then when the Depression struck, at the very moment when Halifax and West Riding was on its knees, she came to appreciate what it was all about and came to love her hometown and to give up her life for it. But that's not what she was saying in her diaries. So these are 3 diary extracts from the mid-30s. I must accept this gloomy Yorkshire life and make something of it. I feel hysterically thwarted, furious, even murderous. Life so unspeakably dreary here, nothing but work and taking mother out and listening to her complaints. And then how I long to be away in a tiny flat in London. And I could give you dozens of these. What was this all about? Partly it was just a quirk of personality. I think Phyllis had a bit of a depressive streak. And she certainly suffered a lot with, as did many people this time, with very low-level medical problems, which kind of sagged her energy. I think she got bored with Halifax in the way that people sometimes get bored with their hometowns, just because you do see the same people and the same faces. I think she was going through some very difficult personal relationships, particularly at this time. Phyllis constructed her autobiography to make it look as though men never found her attractive and she never found males attractive in a sense of not wanting at least to undermine her writing career and her independence by marrying. And she implies strongly in her autobiography that she never had a sexual relationship. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth. And this, particularly in the late 30s, she got involved in one, not at the same time, but 2 very, very difficult sexual relationships. One with St. John Irving, the Irish playwright and biographer of George Bernard Shaw and the theatre critic of The Observer, who treated her very badly. I think Irving had an eye for the ladies, and she was one of many that he strung along. And then with George Platte Brett, who was the American head of Macmillan Publishing, her publishers. She had an on-off transatlantic, both Irving and Brett were married men, and she had an on-off transatlantic relationship with Brett that lasted from 1939 to 1961. Margaret, I don't know where Margaret is, but Margaret Barnes also discovered her canoodling on the couch with J.B. Priestley in 1964. We're planning to investigate this a bit further. It seems to be a sort of sexual but platonic relationship, if that makes sense. But listen, I'll let Margaret do that one next time. But these relationships really damaged her, particularly, and it's no coincidence that a fallout with the Thespians took place at the exact moment she was in this crisis of a relationship with Irving. She also had an appalling relationship with her mother. She's honest about it in the book, but in her diaries it's much worse. She wrote this when her mother died in 1949. "Poor mother, poor little thing, I must not grow to love her." What a thing to say about your mother. That, you know, she's dead, I feel sorry for her. No, I mustn't feel sorry for her. She was the, as I said at the beginning, she's the daughter of one brother in Australia, 2 other brothers tied up with the family firm, was domestic help. But Phyllis was always expected to be her mother's helpmate and to be there for her, as it were. And she was desperately critical of Phyllis. She never gave her that support. So she was, when Phyllis was down, saying, you know, get a bad critical review, she'd say, "Well, what can you expect? It's not very good, is it?" I think Phyllis eventually came to realise actually that was her mother's way of loving her. That she, you know, she did care about her, but she just couldn't communicate it. And I think a lot of her problem in Halifax was just thinking, I'm trapped by this. The other thing, and I'm going to have to belt through this, I'm sorry about this, was that she had a huge inferiority complex about being provincial. And I think this is, again, a real kind of clue to her. It may come from her time at Cheltenham Ladies College, and had to do elocution lessons at Cheltenham. And they tried very hard to drive her Yorkshire accent away from her. It never succeeded. But it's a theme in her writing that her Yorkshire characters, Carmine Mellor, who's a teacher in Inheritance, who goes to work in London, Henry Morecambe, a very important character called Laura Armitstead in the novel Sleep in Peace, which is a heavily autobiographical novel. Laura Armitstead is Phyllis Bentley. All suffer from, as I say earlier on, what Alan Bennett called a disease of the vowels. What to do when you're in London. And all these characters have these hang-ups about being northern and being ashamed of the way they speak and being embarrassed. And one of the clue, and again, I thank Margaret 2 or 3 times this lecture, but Margaret Barnes gave me a copy of Phyllis's will recently. And the most remarkable thing about Phyllis's will is she described herself as Phyllis Bentley, Doctor of Literature. That is not a job. That's an honorary degree from Leeds University in 1949. She's an author, she's a writer, she's a broadcaster. She's not a doctor of literature. But that, again, is a remarkable sign of that insecurity, that she doesn't ever quite believe in herself. She wants to be known in a will in that way. Her insecurities come out most of all in her relationship, appalling relationship with Vera Brittain. I hope there aren't too many Vera Brittain fans here, because I'm on Phyllis's side in this. The next slide, please. There we are, picture there of Phyllis with the glasses, Winifred Holtby at the back, Vera on the right-hand side, and the 2 children, John and the little girl in the middle, who you will know as Baroness Williams, Shirley Williams, Vera Brittain's daughter. Phyllis met, the crucial thing about this relationship, they met in 1932, is that Phyllis Bentley is the top dog. If you go out on the streets of Halifax now and say, the streets of London, let's say, have you heard of Phyllis Bentley? Have you heard of Vera Brittain? Oh yes, well-known figure. In 1932, Vera Brittain is a struggling novelist. Vera Brittain has just written Inheritance. And Winifred Holtby, who lived in London with Brittain, was a mutual friend. She introduced them, and there's no doubt at all that Vera Brittain wanted to meet Phyllis Bentley, partly because she opened doors. Brittain's most important book, Testament of Youth, which was filmed again a couple of years ago, that was placed with Victor Gollancz and Macmillan, largely because of Phyllis's work on her behalf, a really, really important book that she was partly midwife to. They had initially got on incredibly well, had a very, very intense friendship, partly because they felt they had things in common. The problems of being a writer in a domestic environment. Vera Brittain had 2 little children and a husband that was an American political philosopher who was out of the country a lot of the time. And she had a mother. And these were domestic ties that got in the way. But they soon fell out in big time. For a number of reasons. Vera was rude to Phyllis. She more or less told her she wasn't really a particularly good writer, I think. Phyllis was extremely sensitive. There may have been a sexual overtone. I don't think there was. I think it was a chronic misunderstanding. But their friendship is a bit like a schoolgirl crush. In the first 6 months of 1932, Vera Brittain wrote Phyllis 45 letters, which is, even Winifred Holby, who was a sort of lifelong friend, jokingly saying, you're making me a bit jealous here. I'm being pushed out of the way. But what Vera Brittain did was make Phyllis Bentley feel like the provincial ugly duckling. Next one, Jane, please. I promise we're getting closer. And again, I'll read this out in case you can't see it, if I can find it. This is Phyllis on herself. This is from her autobiography in 1962, looking back. By 1932, I was thoroughly provincial. By this I mean I was simple, naive, credulous, apt to accept anything said to me at face value. My clothes were all wrong for London. My chestnut brown hair and hazel eyes had led me to clothe myself in brown and gold and flame-coloured tweeds, with what an American friend of mine once called walking felt hats, perfectly appropriate to the West Riding landscape, but worlds removed from the formal dress then thought suitable for London. Also, though I did not realise it at the time, I shared those Yorkshire characteristics with which I most disliked in my fellow Yorkshiremen. I was both blunt and reserved. Next slide, Jed, please. Vera, on the other hand, Vera was beautiful. She had a husband, and you can almost hear the brackets, I haven't. 2 children, I haven't. An Oxford degree, I haven't. I've got a past degree from London University by Cheltenham College. She was admirably dressed, I'm not. Spoke and wrote fluent, pointed Oxford English. I've got a Yorkshire accent. And knew hosts of interesting people in literary London. And her friendship with Vera just brought out all these insecurities and tensions in herself. The problem also with Vera Brittain was she was an appalling snob. By her own accounts, she suffered from the snobbery of provincialism, of disliking the provinces. So much so that she often was represented as a southerner. Her friend Winifred Holby, trying to bring the two women, trying to bring Phyllis and Vera together after they had a fallout, said of Vera, well, you know these southerners. Vera Brittain was born in Newcastle-under-Lyme and grew up in Buxton. As far as I know, Buxton isn't a London suburb, but she kind of literally invented herself as a kind of chic metropolitan. And set against her, Phyllis just found herself in a Yorkshire life and a Halifax life very, very difficult. I'm going to try to explain very briefly. Just one more slide here for now, please. This is my favourite letter ever written by anybody to anyone. This is Vera Brittain's apology for upsetting Phyllis Bentley. She came to Halifax for a weekend. She was extremely ill. She thought she was pregnant. Actually, she had a horrendously serious medical condition. She stayed with Phyllis and her mother for 3 or 4 days. It all went horribly wrong. Phyllis took her to the opera, said, please don't come, you're too ill. Vera said, no, I'll come, and sure, I had to go interval. Phyllis wanted to go to an opera party in the evening, but she couldn't go, blah, blah, blah. They had various fallouts. And this is Vera's apology. I'd look forward to seeing you, to staying with you. Perhaps it seems hard to believe that for a person whose life is so full and exciting as mine, a quiet week in a provincial town with a family I didn't know should have seemed so entertaining a prospect. But it represented such a change and such peace, and above all the opportunity of getting to know you better. That's an apology. It might surprise you that an important person like me might want to go to a boring place like Halifax for a week. So you could perhaps see why they didn't actually end up getting on. And this devastated Phyllis Bentley. Her diaries for 2 or 3 years are full of, got a letter from Vera, burst into tears. Went to dinner party, Vera was there, fled. They sort of patched it up to public consumption when Winifred Holby died. But when she wrote her autobiography, the very last bit she rewrote was the section on her relationship with Vera Brittain, and she sent it to Vera Brittain to check that there was nothing untoward and that there was nothing that could kind of give away the extent to which they disliked each other. Now, I've rattled on a lot longer than I meant to, so I will shut up. But just simply to say, things did get better for her in the 50s and 60s. She did settle. rather more into, she accepted a lot, and made new friendships and stuck with a work in Halifax. But just one slide, Jed, and then if you just jump onto the next one. Just go straight up to the last one. This is very sad. It is a bit of a sad note to end on, really. In 1962, she was interviewed for a TV programme about her life, and she went back and wrote in her diary, the interviewer tried to make me say I lived in a stuffy bourgeois atmosphere, and I would have written better if I'd left Yorkshire. I ought to have said I would have been a happier person, but a worse writer. Which is perhaps, excuse me, losing my voice, it's kind of a sad note, sad, poignant note, isn't it? Actually, what matters more, that I was a good writer, but wasn't happy, and if I'd gone away and lived somewhere else, my life might have worked out differently. Perhaps a too negative a note to end on, but I don't think my voice is going to take any more. So I will just leave it on the slightly anticlimactic and downbeat note. I will leave it there. Thank you very much for your patience in putting up with me.